Hi everyone, and welcome to this concept searching webinar on why you need metadata-driven records management. My name is Robert Piddocke, and I'm joined by our CTO today, Michael Paye. Michael has been a SharePoint and search expert for many years, and he knows quite a lot about Microsoft, and he's in charge of developing the concept searching product. So we're very pleased and lucky to have Mike here with us to show us a little bit about our product later on in the presentation. But first, I will show you some information about how records management works and how it should be driven by metadata, and hopefully that will drive us to an understanding of why concept searching products can help you. I'm in charge of business and channel development here at Concept Searching. I have been working with information management for more than a decade. I'm a certified information professional and have written a couple books on search. So I am pleased to present to you today a little bit about records management, which is a space I've also worked in and done quite a lot of presentations and work on as well. So I hope you enjoy the presentation today. So a short agenda, and I would like to also mention that this webinar will be recorded, and everyone who's registered will get a copy of it. So if you have to drop off, no problem. If you have questions, please let us know. We probably won't be addressing them during the webinar, but we will definitely get back to you with an answer on those. So first, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to concept searching, who we are if you don't know already. I won't linger too long there because I want to get into the topic itself, which is an introduction to records and how we are generally managing records manually in our organization. We'll talk a little bit about the future of records in the Microsoft world, because a lot of interesting changes are happening there, and this will be part of Mike's presentation to show us exactly what's coming in that space and how we can support that. And then we'll talk about our first records steps, what we need to do in order to get success with records. And we'll do a demo, and then I'll just overview those key takeaways. This is kind of a Microsoft-focused presentation. We'll be talking about SharePoint and Office 365, but most of the information is very general. So if you're using something other than SharePoint, a lot of it may also pertain to you. I hope we can address those points as well. Moving on. Excuse me. Concept was founded in 2002 as a search vendor, and we have developed since then a technology that allows people to understand what their content is about. And this gives us the ability to classify your content. We've been working for probably 15 years now on making our search-driven technology a classification tool. So we do a lot of taxonomy management and data classification. We have a lot of customers. Most of our customers are working in the professional services, financial services, and government, but we do have many smaller customers that have a lot of data, and that's really the place where people need a company like Concept Searching and our products, is if you have a lot of data that you don't know what to do with and you want to get that classified, our products are going to help you in that place. What makes us different? Well, there's a lot of companies out there helping you to understand what your content is about, and a lot of new technology, especially in the AI and machine learning, with some really bold promises on how to do that. But our technology is about metadata and about organizing metadata based on some very well-founded mathematical principles. We use these principles in our unique intellectual property we call compound term processing. This allows us to get a statistical view, of all of the content you have in your organization, which we've collected with our search-based technology, and find out what it's about. So we just don't understand keywords, and it's not as simple as some of the technology that we can get out of the Microsoft stack that will just allow us to see which keywords or which words are in different documents. We can actually see phrases, more complex terms. So for our typical example is triple heart bypass, which we all know is a surgical operation. And each one of its words by itself has some meaning. And these words could be all over your content, but together it's a unique operation that has specific meaning. And everyone's content is different. our system can go out and figure out what your content is about and find these compound terms that are going to be relevant for you and let you utilize those to build a file plan and do records classification, among other information management tasks. Sorry. So let's get on to records. I think you've probably all seen this Dilbert comic if you are into records, and this is basically what our perception of what happens with records. We take it to the record center, or we ask our records manager to look after it, and then it just disappears and no one ever uses it again. And this is kind of tongue-in-cheek because we all know that the records in our organization are our most important asset. They're the information that we've decided we need to keep, or we've been mandated we need to keep. So what do we do with that? How do we decide what is a record, and then what do we do with those records once we have identified them? So a record is a record regardless of what form it's in. It could be a physical record or it could be an electronic record, but it doesn't depend on what kind of form you have. It needs to be a record based on what kind of information it is and what we decide we need to keep or we don't need to keep. There is some discussion that everything is a record in your organization. All information you have is a record, but you just need to decide which records you need to keep and which ones you need to delete, and which ones you need to keep forever. One of the biggest problems with records and identifying records, and this is really the crux of this presentation, is that we are expecting everyone in our organization to go out and tell us what is a record and what it needs to be done, and what needs to be done with it. And most of the records don't have any kind of information that explains to us what those items are. So if we have a policy, who's to decide that that's a policy and how long we're going to keep it? Organizations also have an influx of many different kinds of information nowadays. Social media is growing vastly, and companies are implementing things like Microsoft Teams and Yammer, where we have discussion. Are these items records, and do we need to keep these items? We also don't have very good control of how our policies and our records are being distributed. So we need to be able to identify them wherever they land and do something with them. Lastly, and I think importantly, businesses need to keep control of their records. More and more, we have to be responsible for what the information we have. We've seen so many breaches where people's personal information and records are being distributed to places that they shouldn't be, stolen, hacked, moved, and not having a proper control of these records is going to have an adverse effect and potentially result in fines for our organization. So why would we want to keep a record? Like, we have a specific document in our organization or some information. Why do we want to keep those records? Well, in a lot of cases, we're mandated to keep those records. We have some rules that say everything that's a contract needs to be kept for 7 years before you may delete it. Many organizations get around this by just keeping things forever. But this is a big problem because we're exposing ourselves to legal risk by keeping things for longer than we have to. If we're involved in a court case and we do some legal discovery and we find out that we have some incriminating documents in our organization that we could have potentially legally destroyed, there's a very big problem in keeping it. Also, new regulations like GDPR, which is really just an addendum to many other regulations that we have, especially here in the US, are making us more aware of the fact that we need to protect personal information and make it available and make it possible to delete that information. And if we don't have it set as a record, we can't really manage that properly. So where are the records in our organization? Well, this is quite interesting. There's been some research on this. And there are different zones where your information is and your records are distributed. 80% are in an area where people can read them and delete them, and they are potentially deleted after a period of time. Then there's, excuse me, a smaller percentage that is hidden away in different kinds of systems like emails, And these are very difficult to declare as records, and they often sit because people don't want to get rid of them. They might need to go back and look at them. And often these systems are not exposed to records management like Exchange and those kinds of things, or at least in the past they haven't been. Now we can support labels in Exchange, which is a great new thing, and you can manage your records in there as well. And then there's the last zone, which is a very small percent, which is actually properly managed records that could be in email or elsewhere that are being classified and managed properly. My apologies, I think I'm getting a cold. It is the fall, so might have to mute to cough now and again. I'm very sorry about that. Records management system, what do we need in our records management system? Well, first of all, we need some content analysis. And this is a big gap. I think we're going to see in the next few slides that this is the biggest failing point. Many people, when they think of records management, they think about a retention and when am I going to delete this stuff, which is what I've been talking about. But really the biggest failing point is in the early stages of records management, identifying records. And that really is the first step. Let's look at our content and find out what we have, what could be records, where those records are potentially held, and then do something about it. Our next step is, of course, to have a file plan. A file plan is basically a taxonomy, a list of categories that has our retention schedules applied to it. These are often legally mandated and they have their own structure that is very standardized, that we can say, here are some retention schedules and these types of documents, whether they're engineering documents, contracts, invoices, these kinds of things, should have a specific retention period, and that's going to be described by our file plan. Of course, you need a way to manage a file plan, and you need some way to apply your retention schedules to that file plan. Many organizations have by far too complex file plans. It's like putting very large things in very small buckets, and that becomes very difficult to work with. So we want to try to keep big buckets and build our file plan in line with our retention schedules. If we only have things that we need to keep for 2 years, 7 years, and archive forever, there's no point in having 5,000 different retention schedules. You should also have a compliance requirement document. So that tells you how things are being met and how your compliance is being met by the use of your records management system and your file plan. You should also understand how you collect records. Where are those records placed? If you are familiar with SharePoint and SharePoint Online, you'll know that you can do both in-place records management and use records centers. Now with new technology in Office 365, we're moving much more to doing in-place as a standard. But you need to understand how records are collected and how they're moved throughout your organization and then eventually destroyed. You also need to be able to audit your records and place holds on those records. So if something happens, let's say there's some litigation and we need to freeze a record so that it doesn't get deleted in the meantime while we have to work with it, we need to be able to hold on that record. So these are all capabilities that we need in our records management system. And we need to be able to capture that record's metadata as well, so that we can potentially hold that to prove that we had that record and we destroyed that record. And all of this needs to be monitored and reported on. So how is this all supposed to work? I mean, there's a lot of requirements there. It's very ominous, let's say, that we need a way to leverage these records and manage these records. And for us, we strongly believe that the core to that is metadata management. Both in the file plan, the movement of the records, and the disposition of those records are all dependent on the quality of your metadata. So when you have your file plan, you really need to be able to sync it to the metadata that describe what those documents are about. The reason for this is that documents in themselves are not generally intrinsically identifiable. So we can't look at a project document and understand that it's a project document about a contract that was issued at a specific time. We need some kind of higher level of information to help us to associate that project document with the contract and with the project that we worked on, and even the time frame from that project. And this can really only be effectively done with metadata. Sometimes those documents, or usually those documents, have some clues in them to try to help us to understand. But when we're dealing with millions of documents, it's nearly impossible for us to manually go through each one of those documents, decide what kind of a record it potentially is, and then classify it. So metadata becomes the core to many of these different areas in this cycle of capturing metadata, profiling data, building rules that make this process flow of records management actually work, and all of these elements in this circle capable. Many people now have the procedure and the policy, if you will, of a manual approach to metadata and a manual approach to records management, which means that your end users are being asked to decide what, or maybe worse than that, a single records manager in the organization is being asked to decide what metadata should be on a document, and specifically which node in our file plan, in our records classification scheme, that document should be and what kind of record it should be. So if I'm working with that project document again, I'm being asked which one of these 1,000 records classifications should this one be. I'm a project manager. I have no idea what our retention requirements are. So choosing something from there is really just a major legal risk for our organization. So we need a better way to do it. Most of the time, manual metadata tagging, and this even works, applies to systems where we're moving things around in, say, SharePoint, or from Exchange to SharePoint, and we're asking our end users to do it manually. We're going to have a massive failure. These techniques are inconsistent. Most of the end users do it sometimes, they don't do it. One end user is really good, one is bad. They're really subjective. People are not highly trained to do records management or identify the appropriate metadata on content. It's expensive. Nobody likes to do it. I don't want to spend hours a day enriching content for the organization when I'm not getting compensated for that. I'm getting compensated to get my projects done. So I don't want to sit there and do the records manager's job. And of course, the records manager doesn't have the time to do it on millions of documents. There's also malicious compliance. People get angry and they do silly things. They know it's not supposed to be in the top category, but they're going to put it anyway because they're not interested in that. And of course, that's because of the lack of perceived value on doing these things. So manual metadata approach is just a general failure. And this all starts at the beginning of the whole cycle. I know when we talk about records management, we generally, and we look at records management products in the market, we generally see how they're handling disposition, because that's kind of the most interesting part of the process. But really the process starts at the capture side. We're not capturing the information properly. And that could be physical records that are being captured, or it could be electronic records that are already there but poorly tagged. They're generally created from a subjective frame. They don't match our local governance policies. They don't have a lot of transparency. They may be in our ECM systems, or they may just be on file shares or an email. And it's a big problem. And we can't do the rest of the things in this stage: management, storage, preservation, and eventually disposition, if we don't have this first step done. It's really the first important link in a chain that becomes very weak if we don't have it done properly. So the solution, of course, is to have proper metadata done automatically early on, based on a controlled vocabulary. So that could be our file plan or some other taxonomy that helps us to automatically categorize items, which we then can manage, store, and eventually dispose of, because this metadata that we have on it is telling us the nature of that document and how it should be handled in the organization. And really the only effective way to do that with the massive amounts of information that we have these days is automatic metadata tagging. We can't really ask our end users to do it. It's just going to be a failure. So the way we manage that, and the way that we should manage that, is with a taxonomy. And as I mentioned before, our file plan is generally a taxonomy, a hierarchical representation of the entities of interest in or importance in our organization. And we try to keep them as general as possible to match those retention schedules, but they should also match our business needs. And we can structure our data, and that taxonomy, that file plan, needs to be a controlled vocabulary. We can't just be asking our end users to enter anything we want, because we're not going to be able to get that kind of control that we need for retention and disposition unless we have end users that that can choose from a controlled list, or we have it done automatically, which is clearly a much better approach. Business taxonomies can be very flexible, so you can have both your file plan and you can have some other taxonomies applied, so that our end users can get a broader view of the product and also have, or the product, I'm sorry, the content, but also have the ability to have those documents properly classified. So let's talk a little bit more about classification, and then we'll jump into a demo with Mike. But I think we've come to the point to realize that we need auto-classification early on in order to drive records management. And that's just really the first and the most major point, failure point with records management. So what do they do? What's an auto-classification system? First of all, auto-classification system starts with document preparation. It's going to open your document and it's going to split it into different kinds of information that you have. Concept searching, of course, as I mentioned, is unique in that we can open up the document and find out the compound terms in that document, all of the statistically relevant phrases that are related to the kinds of classifications that you might want to make. And this is the parsing stage, where we extract entities, we use natural language processing to find terms, compound terms, variants, and then apply weighting to them. The weighting, of course, based on a statistical model, can tell us which terms and phrases are much more important than others and can be good clues for you to apply your classifications to. Then the final stage is to actually apply those classifications. So this should all be done automatically. So we should be able to have some rule sets which match in a fuzzy manner. They're not just keywords to say if you find the word policy, decide that's a policy. We want it to be much more flexible than that, because the word policy is going to appear all over the place. So we want to be able to say, if policy is near a procedure and policies and procedures are part of the documents, then we can confidently say that this is going to be a policy procedure. It needs a records classification, and we need to hold on to it for 7 years at minimum, and then make that classification. So to build a concept index, we use our unique approach with this statistical model that I mentioned in order to go from a very specific taxonomy to tagging those classifications directly. And the concept classifier can help in the way that you build these classifications, because you can start with your file plan and have some very top level big buckets, as I mentioned. Ask concept searching, which is crawled all of your content, to evaluate which content you have based on that big bucket, that file plan node, and then give you some suggestions of what kind of content is actually in your organization, which then can be applied to that. Let's talk about a little bit about Office 365. As I mentioned, that's going to be a bit of a focus here for us. If it's in your future, and I think it is in everyone's future, unless you're already committed to M-Files or OpenText or some other kind of records management, document management system, and you're on SharePoint, you're probably either going to go hybrid or directly to Office 365. And the great news here is that at Ignite recently, we saw a lot of great advancements in the records management space. So there's a file plan capability in Office 365. It's going to be a complete collaboration platform with things like Teams and Yammer, which is going to help you to collect all of the information and then manage it as a record with latest functionality and labels, which is also being further rolled out across all of Office 365 and into Windows file shares as well. So we're going to see a lot of advancements which are going to help us in the later stages of records management. The benefits of Office 365, as you all know, is that it's cheaper. You have less capital expenditures for these kinds of things, reduces the complexity of your infrastructure, and there's a consolidation of your administration. On top of that, you will be able to support a much broader way that records management is done. The thing that it doesn't address, though, is the problem that we talked about before, and that's how we get that added information, how we define those records upon upload, and how we enrich the content with metadata so that we don't break that first stage and we can actually go through and successfully meet the rest of the stages in the process. And that's where we come in. There are some issues with SharePoint now, and I think you all know that our file plan is our only way to have a taxonomy. We, of course, can have managed metadata, but we can't do any kind of automatic tagging with those. It all has to be manual. Retentions is not that strong in SharePoint. Disposition is difficult right now, although that is improving with Office 365. We don't really have any way of managing physical records, although it's not terribly difficult to create a list and just manage them with the list in SharePoint. And there is limited auditing. Reporting in SharePoint, well, if you use reporting, you don't need me to tell you how out of the box it is. Although we do have some great functionality with Power BI that you should look into. Finally, I kind of already mentioned this, but why do you need what we do? And that's really down to the fact that the first stage of records management is the identification of the records. And we really don't have a better way of doing it than manual records classification unless you use an automation tool like concept searching, the rule-based engine. Sometimes people say, well, what about AI? Can't I use AI for that? Unfortunately, AI is not ready for prime time, and the techniques that we use are very well founded and well proven. Maybe in some time AI will get in this space to be capable enough for us to use, but right now it's not. It's kind of like the new technology that's been the new technology for the last 30 years and is really never quite there to do it. So if you want to do proper classification and records management now, you need a product like concept search. I'm going to just mention labels briefly because we saw in Ignite that there was an expansion of the way that labels work in Office 365, which is going to support your records management capabilities. We've got a new label, sensitivity labels, and retention labels have gathered more capabilities to them. So we're getting a much broader and more useful experience with labels in Office 365. And the news is that in 2019, these will be extended to file shares as well. So we can actually do records management on file shares effectively using labels. This is all part of the advanced governance suite of tools, which will require a special Microsoft license. So not just everybody gets these functionality. But they're very good for high-level classifications. And we can use them also, as I mentioned, to identify sensitive data and control. There's actually a different kind of label. We have a retention label and we have a sensitivity label. So that Microsoft is really expanding these capabilities so that we can do better retention and supervision. Just some things to worry about labels if you're going to use them. It may take up to 7 days for your labels to be applied automatically. A colleague of mine at our local SharePoint user group applied a label, and it took more than 10 days for that to get out to do the retention schedule. So yeah, be aware of the labels. Of course, you used to be able to only have one label, but now you can have two, but you can only have one retention label. So, so yeah, be aware of that limitation as well. And of course, if you have content in other systems, it's going to be very difficult to classify that content and manage it outside of Office 365. It's good for Microsoft because we'll get all our stuff into to Office 365, but not so good for us, those of us who have all sorts of different systems in our organization. So yeah, some gotchas with labels, be careful with them, but overall, if you're willing to make some small sacrifices, labels can be a great technology for you. So let's jump to a demo. I'm going to just share or make Mike our presenter, and I think I've talked enough. So I will I'll let him give us a look at the product.
That's great. Thank you, Robert.
Should be presented.
There we go. So hopefully that's switched across now. Right, so the demonstration today is very much going to be focused on the user story of records management in Office 365, what we have today, how concept searching can work with that, and some of the functionality that we know is coming in the future. And I'm going to start that demonstration off by taking a look at the Office 365 Security and Compliance Center. What Microsoft have really done here is started the process of building a portfolio of tools that administrators can use when trying to manage risk within their organization. And as part of this process, they've introduced this concept of labels that Robert's mentioned. Now, I'd like to start off by drawing your attention to the fact that there are two different types of label at the moment: sensitivity and retention. Now, my demonstration, obviously, because this webinar is about records management, will be largely focused on retention labels, but it is important that we understand the differences as well as the similarities between the two different types. So sensitivity labels were very recently introduced, a lot of the announcements happening a few weeks ago at Microsoft Ignite. And these labels are very much focused on the security of documents, in particular supporting functionality such as watermarking, the ability to highlight headers and footers for end users so that they know when they're editing a secure document, as well as certain protection to prevent documents leaving an organization in an unsecure manner. On the other side, we have our retention labels, which we'll be looking at today. And these were introduced a little over a year ago, and they allow us to define our retention policies for our documents, as well as allowing us to remove content when it gets to a particular age. So you can see here we've got a couple of labels that we've created for demonstration purposes. Where these labels overlap to a degree is how we can automatically apply them with Office 365. And we can do this very easily, as you can see in the UI, by clicking Auto Apply a Label. So this is built-in SharePoint functionality, and I will hasten to add this is, as Robert mentioned, a delayed effect. So if I change my policies or a new document gets added, it can take a week or 10 days in the case of Robert's example for that to get applied to a document. So there is a certain amount of lag, but it does give us some functionality in applying our labels automatically. So the first method we have, which we can see in our checkboxes here, is applying labels to content that contains sensitive information. And this is effectively pattern-based detection, looking for perhaps social security numbers or credit cards, or certain regional patterns that we care about, so bank account numbers or your local identifier. We do also have the ability to look for keywords and phrases, although I would highlight that the editor for this interface is fairly IT-centric, so there is an expectation that the end user would be capable of writing what we'd call Boolean expressions, so it contains this word and this word or this word, something to that effect, which may not be appropriate for every user. So I think the key thing to take away from these auto application techniques that are built in is that they are fairly heavy-handed and do rely to an extent on a bit of IT experience to set them up correctly. And this is one of the places that concept searching can be brought in to leverage existing business language or capabilities that might exist, as well as structures within taxonomies, to use auto classification to drive the application of these labels quicker perhaps than the 7 days, but also with a variety of other business techniques more than are available through the standard compliance center. I will also add, before I move across to the concept searching side of the demo, that Microsoft do, as Robert mentioned, have some other great functionality coming out soon. So the file plan capability, with the capability to then link that to the labels we're defining, is scheduled for Q4. And we are also seeing a capability coming out soon where we can map labels to content types in SharePoint, which helps us with our existing content. So obviously a lot of people with records management solutions in SharePoint create all of their content types, and they use that to categorize their documents. So you'll be able to then map those to your labels. So now I'm going to go across to concept searching. And we're going to talk about, just very quickly, I will sort of show the standard interface that people, if you've ever seen one of our webinars before, you will have seen. So this is the taxonomy structure within concept searching and some of the rules that are being used to classify documents. I will hasten to add that we have hundreds of techniques or different ways around things to classify documents in very subject specific ways. So what we're looking for here is not IT administrators, but people that understand their content and need to be able to identify it in lots of business ways. So that might be, as it is in this case, based on natural language, where we're looking for words or phrases, these compound terms that Robert was mentioning, or it may be a whole host of other ways. So we've got regular expressions, which is the pattern-based detection that we were talking about. We have language-based expressions, so we can say we're looking for content in certain languages. Metadata expressions, which could be as simple as we would expect, so looking at the age of a document, or it might be looking at the users that worked with that document, so the modifier, the creator, as well as any other metadata that's available in SharePoint. We have a concept again of Boolean expressions if we want to build things together as well. So it really can be as simple as you need it to be or as complicated as you need it to be to describe your business needs and then auto-classify your documents as appropriate. I won't go into this any further on this particular webinar, but if you are curious about the auto-classification techniques we have, then I would encourage you to look on our website under the Demos on Demand section, where you can see various videos describing the capabilities and demonstrating deeper how Taxonomy Manager works with your business language. So I'm now going to go across to another term and another taxonomy in the same interface, and we're going to look at one of the ways in which concept searching allows you to apply labels automatically. So if I bring up the settings for this particular term, we can scroll down and we can see a section designated Microsoft Office Classification Labels. And what we can do here is very easily define which labels are mapped to this particular term. So what we're mirroring here is the functionality we saw in Office 365 of sensitive information detection. So we have the PII term, so if it's PII information, we're mapping it to the sensitive label. And this really allows us to have perhaps multiple labels across multiple site collections, map them all into a single point in our taxonomy structure, and use our already existing taxonomies that we may have, or potentially new ones that can be used for a variety of systems, and map them to our Office 365 label techniques or labels that we have. So this is one way we can do it, and this then takes part of the auto-classification process. As we classify a document and write back to SharePoint, we'll write back this label as well. The other technique is perhaps a little more targeted, and it works on the basis of our concept taxonomy workflow product. Again, if you want any more information on the workflow product, then there are webinars and demos on demand available for that. But the overarching concept of it is effectively we have a set of conditions that we're looking for, and based upon those conditions, we perform an action. So very simply, in this case, we're looking for one, or in this case, 3 taxonomies. If any of those taxonomies are tagged, then we're going to write an Office 365 label, and the label we're going to write is called secure. So it's a very simple interface for end users to be able to derive quite specific conditions to push their labels out in a very specific manner. So those are the 2 ways that concept searching allows you to apply your labels to SharePoint without needing to use the automated policies in Office 365. So now let's take a look at that from a SharePoint perspective. What we have here is a really typical SharePoint document library that concept searching has been targeting. So within this library, we have lots of content that we can see has managed metadata applied to it. And this really is what concept searching does on a day-to-day basis. We look for content, we analyze it, and then based upon that, we apply metadata tags to it to be used by other systems, in this case, the system being SharePoint. Again, There are lots of demos on demand of this functionality, so I won't go into this too much. What I will draw your attention to is the fact that there are two columns here, IPSV and Enterprise, and both of those are being tagged in the way that we saw on the first term in Taxonomy Manager, classifying based upon natural language in those documents. And across here we have another taxonomy, workflow, and this is the sensitive one that we're looking at in terms of the application of the label. So what we'll do now is take a look at that experience from an end user perspective and see how those labels would get applied and talk through the process as we're bringing some documents into SharePoint. So I'm going to drag these documents into the library. We're uploading those now. So what's going to happen now is hooks that we have into the SharePoint environment are going to fire off to the concept searching server, which will allow us to start processing those documents, and we can see we've got some awaiting in the queue there. So if we go back, we have those documents now that have uploaded into SharePoint, so we know they've all processed through and they've popped up on the queue. So concept searching is now pulling in all the taxonomy information that we have, grabbing the text out of them, and in the case of one of these documents that we see here, an image, OCRing the document on the fly to grab out the text from that. And actually, if we look at that particular one, we will note there is a credit card number, although it is quite small, you possibly can't see it quite on the preview there, but there is a credit card number in there. The concept searching will then use to start applying the information and applying those tags and applying those labels. And we can see those are starting to come through now. So if we go back to our dashboard, we should see that most of those have now processed through the system. Okay, so that's now finished. So what we can see if we scroll through very easily at the top level view of the library, we can see that tags have been applied. And at the same time, if we then click on one of these documents, what we should see is the label has been applied to these. So what we've done is targeted the ones that have in particular been identified as PII and applied that sensitivity label, sorry, the retention label, but called sensitive. And if we look at one of these other ones, obviously we wouldn't expect to see the label there. So this is using sort of the like-for-like behavior that we've seen from Office 365 to concept searching, then doing its pattern-based detection. But what I really do want to emphasize is that concept searching can use all of its auto-classification capabilities to apply those labels in the exact same way, making it very easy for an end user that perhaps doesn't actually have full access to the compliance center to build up these rules and apply your business language in the ways that are needed to get those labels on there. I hope that was useful for you. I'm now going to pass back to Robert, who will be giving you a bit more information on records management. There we go, Robert. Thank you.
Okay, that was great. That was super interesting. I appreciate it. So I'll just, we're running out of time, so I'll just wrap up quickly if I can. Let me see if I can get here. So one thing that I wanted to mention is that we're really bound to doing records management now, and we need to make sure that it's something that is part of our compliance and governance strategy. There are a lot of laws out there which dictate that we need to protect information, and we also want to make sure that we're not legally liable for information that we don't have to keep a hold of. So doing proper records management and having a way to automate that is really the only solution. So how do we make records management information governance in order to help us with these things? We really need to start with the beginning. Start at the beginning is an important part of the message that I'm trying to say here today, and get that extra information into our content so that we can manage it as a record. Information management, as we all know, is really about building a framework in order to manage our information in a way that is safe for both our customers, our users, and our corporation or our organization. And following these steps with records management could bring us a great deal closer to proper information governance. It's really just not enough to have a document that says we should do this. We have to have an implementation in place. And part of that implementation, aside from security, monitoring, protecting personal information is also managing our own records and making sure those are set safe and being dealt with properly. So the results that we want to get really is to have an automated process so we can go through massive amounts of information that we have, tag it, and then either keep it for a specific period of time or dispose of it. That may be very quickly disposed or eventually disposed or archived and kept forever if that's the requirement. But not having the ability to see what that information is about and do that process is going to be a failure point from the beginning. If we have an automation in this, we can do a lot more with that. It's much broader than just records management. We can clean up file shares, we can do pre-migration analysis, and we can of course identify things that need to be kept and set as a record. I think that's about it for me today, and I will like to say thank you to all of you for joining. If there are questions, please share them. I hope we tried to address some of the points that came up. I do notice there are some questions, but I think that in the interest of time and everyone's day, we'll direct those answers to those questions directly to those who asked them. So thank you very much for coming and have a great day.